Hey, what's up, 8 Push Kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today our topic is 8.10, the African American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. We have two learning objectives today. Our first one is 8L, explain how and why various groups responded to calls for the expansion of civil rights from 1960 to 1980. And objective 8M, explain the various ways in which the federal government responded to the calls for the expansion of civil rights. Our first two key ideas go together, and we'll cover them simultaneously. The first one says, during and after World War II, civil rights activists and leaders, most notably Martin Luther King Jr., combated racial discrimination utilizing a variety of strategies, including legal challenges, direct action, and nonviolent protest tactics. And key idea number two says the three branches of the federal government used measures, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to promote greater racial equality. So we'll begin everything by talking about 1961. In 1961, the Freedom Riders rode buses throughout the South to test whether integration orders were being enforced. Now, many of the Freedom Riders were members of SNCC, that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, the Freedom Riders were attempting to challenge and test these integration orders. Now, federal integration orders and a Supreme Court case had determined that the interstate bus system, since it was regulated under federal law, since the Commerce Clause of the Constitution declares that anything that crosses state borders is bound by federal law, that the federal bus system and federal bus stops along that federal system had to be integrated because you could not discriminate under federal law. And so these Freedom Riders were going to travel through the South, see if that was actually happening. They weren't going to obey local ordinances about where to sit on a bus or where you could be at in a bus station. The problem was that these Freedom Riders faced not only arrest but also violence. But what they did was that they exposed the lack of enforcement of desegregation laws throughout the South. And this puts more pressure on the government to start to change laws. Now remember, once again, we've got to understand that the civil rights movement is taking place within the context of the Cold War. When you expose the injustice and the inequality in society on a national level, you're undermining America's argument about our equality during the Cold War. This puts a lot of pressure on national leaders to change those things at home so we don't look bad internationally. It also exposes it to other people, like, hey, here's what's going on. This is bad. This needs to change. Now, after the Freedom Riders are able to make progress, in 1963, we are once again reintroduced to Martin Luther King Jr. Now, the last time we talked about Martin Luther King Jr. was at the Montgomery bus boycotts, which he was very successful. Now, between that point and here, MLK had a varying amounts of success. He had tried similar tactics in many other towns across the South, some of them with very limited success. But he sets his sights on what is known not only as the Magic City, but also as the most segregated city in America, and that's Birmingham, Alabama. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to integrate the public spaces within the city. Now, MLK's strategy was to confront segregation through peaceful marches, rallies, and boycotts. And he was up against an incredibly violent man by the name of Bull Connor. Now, Bull Connor, as the director of public safety, who was both in charge of the fire and police departments, had often in his past deputized Klansmen to help enforce the racial segregationist policies. Now, initially, when Martin Luther King Jr. had come to Birmingham, he had struggled. Most African Americans, adults in the city, had really not wanted to go along. They were fearful of losing their jobs in the primarily white-owned businesses. And so instead, Martin Luther King Jr. controversially turns to using students and children. Now, he made many people upset by putting potentially children in harm's way, and thousands will be arrested. And he's also criticized because he knows Bull Connor will probably use violence, and he does, famously bringing out the water hoses, the attack dogs, and throwing hundreds, thousands of children into jail. And he's roundly criticized Martin Luther King Jr. is in jail during this time. And while in jail, local white preachers publish a letter essentially criticizing Martin Luther King Jr. for moving too fast, putting kids in danger, these things. And he responds. From jail, he responds with what is referred to as the letter from a Birmingham jail. And it is an incredibly powerful piece. It's probably one of the two most powerful things that Martin Luther King Jr. produces during his time. It's this and his I Have a Dream speech. And in his response to white leaders, he essentially says that civil rights can no longer wait. He talks about how it's been so hard for him as a father to tell his kids why they can't go to the amusement park, and because of the color of their skin, and why they can't, why white people are always so mean to them. The change needs to happen now. Not only was this a significant outcome, though, but once again, all of this stuff is on TV. The Birmingham March becomes a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. The TV reports of the violence at Birmingham made it very difficult for average Americans to ignore segregation. And the brutality of both the fire department and the police force is going to force officials to end segregation in Birmingham. And events in Birmingham really revealed the need for greater action by the national government. Among those watching the violence on TV in Birmingham was the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And after watching what's going on, he becomes committed to a National Civil Rights Act to end discrimination. But things were moving slowly. Now, at this time, most Southern political leaders are still members of the Democratic Party. And that's Kennedy's party. So Kennedy's in this really kind of difficult situation because on one hand, much of his own political party is against this. And it's not like the other political party, the Republicans, are going to give him a victory here. So he's in this really difficult spot of trying to push through the civil rights bill. Because really half of his own party is against him, the other party is completely against him. And so Martin Luther King Jr., in 1963, organizes a march on Washington to pressure Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill. Now, part of the movement was not just for political rights, but this is also for economic rights as well. The March on Washington, the 63 March on Washington, it was for rights and jobs, was the name of it. And 250,000 people will gather in Washington, D.C. to hear Martin Luther and others speak on this issue. It is during his speech that he gives his famous I Have a Dream speech about the future without prejudice or without segregation. Now, as a result of this march and the momentum on civil rights, is going to really pressure Kennedy to draft that bill that would outlaw all segregation. But still, it faces an uphill battle. And before the law could be written and passed, President Kennedy is assassinated in Texas in November of 1963. Now, Lyndon Johnson will assume the presidency and will be able to push the bill through Congress. Now, he's able to do so for two really interesting reasons, and they're not on the slide, but I'd like you to be able to kind of write them down. Number one, Johnson was an incredibly persuasive person. He was very well known for being able to guide things through Congress, and he had spent quite a bit of his political career in Congress and the Senate, being able to do so. But number two, and most importantly, it is Kennedy's assassination that gives this law the political capital to be able to move through. Kennedy was an incredibly popular president, and when he dies, the law is his last legacy. And so it becomes difficult for Congress to say no to what would become Kennedy's legacy and what becomes known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Johnson is pictured there signing. This law is incredibly significant because what it does is it outlaws discrimination based on race, religion, and gender, and it ends almost all Jim Crow laws in the United States. It is the fulfillment of what began in 1954 at Brown v. Board of Education, because what it does is it integrates everything. Not only are schools now going to be integrated, but we also see restaurants and hotels and other businesses are going to be integrated. And the Justice Department now has the power to force businesses that fail to comply with the law to begin to comply with this law. However, the Civil Rights Act, though, only goes so far. And despite the successes of the Civil Rights Act, African American leaders are still not entirely satisfied because it doesn't reach to all areas, especially that of voting rights. Most Southern state governments still denied African Americans the right to vote in a variety of ways, going all the way back to the Jim Crow era, including literacy tests and poll taxes that restricted them from voting. In fact, in most Southern states, less than half of eligible African Americans were registered to vote. We can see that in 1940, Georgia, only 3% of African Americans were registered to vote. And by 1964, even though that number is climbing, Georgia's still only at 44%. Mississippi's only at 6.7%. It's still way too low. Civil rights leaders will respond with new initiatives to bring voting rights. For instance, in 1964, white and black college students, mostly from northern universities, are going to take part in what's called Freedom Summer to try and help register African American voters in Mississippi. You can see some of the pictures of them literally going door to door to register people to vote. Now, they did face resistance, and 3 volunteers were murdered by the KKK and by local police during Freedom Summer. In addition to this, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize a march in Selma to bring the issue of voting rights and national attention. Now, even though blacks slightly outnumbered whites in the city of 29,000 people, Selma's voting rolls were still 99% white and only 1% black. Now, for 7 weeks, King led hundreds of Selma black voters to the county courthouse to register to vote. And nearly 2,000 black demonstrators, including King, were jailed by County Sheriff James Clark for contempt of court, juvenile delinquency, parading without a permit. And after a federal court ordered Clark not to interfere with orderly registration, the sheriff forced black applicants to stand in line for up to 5 hours before being permitted to take a literacy test. Not a single black voter was added to the registration rolls. When a young black man was murdered in nearby Marion, King responded by calling for a march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, 50 miles away. On March 7, 1965, black voting rights demonstrators prepared to march. King said, "I can't promise you're not going to get beaten, but we must stand up for what is right." As they crossed the Edmund Bettis Bridge spanning the Alabama River, 200 state police with tear gas, nightsticks, and whips attacked them. Now, the march resumed on March 21st with federal protection. The marchers chanted, "Segregation's gotta fall. You can never jail us all." Now, after the Selma March, LBJ will sign a new law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is going to ban literacy tests and send federal voting officials into the South to protect voters. As a result, voter turnout and registration will increase among black citizens. And this act really finally accomplished what the Republicans had envisioned with the 15th Amendment in 1870. And African Americans will elect black politicians in many of these states for the first time since Reconstruction. As a result, we can see that by 1976, we see African American voting registration in Georgia jump from 3% in 1940 to nearly 75% in 1976. Leading us to key idea number 3. Continuing resistance slowed efforts at desegregation, sparking social and political unrest across the nation. Debates among civil rights activists over the efficacy of nonviolence increased after 1965. Now, by 1965, African American civil rights leaders helped bring an end to segregation and voting restrictions. However, African Americans still faced overwhelming challenges in both jobs and housing. Now, as a result, what we start to see African Americans embracing African culture and black pride. This idea is black is beautiful. And black power started to become the new phrase. The idea of creating economic opportunities through black nationalism, that's black-owned businesses, as well as militant action to protect African Americans. Now, the leading black power groups were SNCC, which had been taken over by Stokely Carmichael, who really changed the group from a focus on nonviolence to a focus on direct action and confrontation. Another group as well, the Black Panthers, on the West Coast, became incredibly important in this idea of black power. Leading us finally to key idea number 4. A series of Supreme Court decisions expanded civil rights and individual liberties during this time for African Americans as well as for others. We see from 1954 to 1980 that the Supreme Court and their rulings led to an increase in civil rights and personal liberties. Now, the court was led by 2 men during this time. First, by Chief Justice Earl Warren, pictured on the right. And of them, he was the most activist and liberal Supreme Court ever. And later, the Burger Court extended much of the Warren Court's liberalism. There are several key court cases that you need to be aware of. Our first one that we've talked about before is Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which made segregation illegal in schools, and it formed the basis for other forms of discrimination to be challenged. However, it did not set a timeline, and southern states led massive resistance to the law. Additionally, in 1967, Loving v. Virginia abolished laws against interracial marriages. And then Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965. This ruled that the Fourth Amendment guaranteed the right to privacy. And this allowed for birth control, and it did set the stage for abortion rights with Roe v. Wade in 1973, which Roe v. Wade is going to legalize a woman's right to have an abortion. 1962, Engel v. Vitale reinforced the separation of church and state and banned school prayer. Today, most schools have moved to a moment of silence because of this particular court ruling. In 1966, Miranda v. Arizona widened the rights of the accused to be informed of their rights. And then 1963, Gideon v. Wainwright guaranteed the right to an attorney to the poor. It also instituted the reading of Miranda rights to all those who were arrested, though they weren't called Miranda rights yet. Mapp v. Ohio, 1961, incorporated the Fourth Amendment to the states. And what this does is it bars the use of evidence in court that was illegally obtained. And New York Times Company v. Sullivan in 1964 expanded and clarified the right of free speech and the free press. It also restricted libel in the press solely to which the publisher knew to be false when published. In addition, Roth v. U.S., what this does is it widened protections for what constituted obscenity. And in Bakke v. Regents of the University of California, it upheld affirmative action, allowing race to be one of the several factors in college admissions policies. Well, that's all our lecture for today. It's been a little bit of a longer one, but we've covered some incredibly important ground, talking about the civil rights movement throughout the 1960s and the importance of the Supreme Court at this time. Please understand that the civil rights movement was successful in many areas, including, and leaders were incredibly influential, successful in getting the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act passed in 1964-65, certainly understand the importance of the Freedom Riders, Martin Luther King Jr., but also understand that the civil rights movement was limited in scope. And after 1965, the civil rights movement struggled with trying to achieve especially economic equality for African Americans. And it's an issue that continues to be a struggle for the African American civil rights movement even to this day. Also understand the importance of the Supreme Court in bringing about more civil liberties, not only to African Americans, but also to people accused of crimes, as well as in other areas as well. Well, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button. Until next time, and as always, go Pack.